Good afternoon, and welcome to this episode of Points of View, a place where politics isn't a taboo, but a conversation starter. I'm Lindsay Wilcox, and I'll be your host for this week's news rundown. On the table today, we have the crisis in Syria, the extension of the Iranian nuclear network, a GOP update, and the passage of the same-sex marriage bill in Maryland. The conditions in Syria continue to deteriorate as violence levels are reaching a new high. Speaking from Tunisia today, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton said that the Assad regime has no future, and that if they do not comply with the ceasefire being pushed by 70 nations from around the world, Assad will have more blood on his hands. Today, Syrian governmental troops killed 8 in the rebel-held central part of the country. A glimmer of hope, though, today as much-needed humanitarian aid is finally arriving to the nation. The Red Cross has evacuated 6 sick and injured people from the city of Homs. According to a UN agency, Iran is rapidly extending their nuclear network. According to International Atomic Energy Agency, in the past 4 months, Iran has increased their production of higher-grade enriched uranium. The just-released report also raises questions about the Iranian government's failure to explain large quantities of uranium metal that went missing. While Iran still insists that it has no interest in producing a nuclear weapon, the report left little doubt that Iran's intentions are anything but peaceful, as new worries continue to emerge about how fast they could produce a nuclear weapon. An update now from the race of the GOP presidential nomination. This past Tuesday saw the 20th and perhaps final Republican debate ahead of next week's primaries in Arizona and Michigan. The two frontrunners, Mitt Romney and Rick Santorum, traded barbs all night as they tried to gain an edge in the tight races. Political observers largely gave the night to Romney, and recent polls seem to back that up, as Romney now holds a narrow lead in Michigan, according to the 2 new polls out on today. And in Arizona, according to the most recent Rasmussen poll of voters, Mitt Romney has opened up a double-digit lead over Rick Santorum. Just yesterday, Maryland's state legislature passed a bill to legalize same-sex marriage. Maryland, following the recent steps of legislatures in Washington and New Jersey, has cleared the way for Maryland to become the 8th state in the union to allow same-sex marriage. And unlike his colleague in New Jersey, Democratic Governor Martin O'Malley says he will sign the bill into law. A referendum challenge is likely to appear on this ballot in November, where ultimately statewide voters will have the final say on whether Maryland will allow same-sex marriage. And in case you were wondering, a recent CBS News poll found that 40% of Americans favor allowing same-sex marriage, while 23% support civil unions and 31% disapprove both. That's all for the news rundown for today. Let's now go over to Britt for a bit of insight on the African American History Month, and to get into the main topic for today, Obama's budget proposal for 2013.
Thanks so much, Lindsay, and good afternoon to everyone. I'm Britt Johnson, and I am so excited to be hosting this portion of Points of View. Now, if you pick up any newspaper, you'll be reminded that it is indeed African American History Month. Now, one specific headline from the Huffington Post caught my eye this week, and it was posted by Yvette Clarke. Now, for just a little bit of a background, she is the U.S. Congresswoman from New York's 11th District. Her article was actually titled, "Black History is American History." And in reading her title, I didn't feel like she was attempting to dismantle such an important month, but she was really problematizing the way in which we, as a society, conceptualize our nation's success, and more importantly, race. And for that reason, I couldn't agree with her title more. It's this idea that we shouldn't be looking at African American history and delegating it to the topic of a chapter in a textbook, a unit in a textbook, or just simply a month. It's this idea that African American history is an integral part of our society, and it has made a big impact, not only for one race, but it's made a big impact for all of America. In reading her text, one of the things that I noticed is that she's reminding us that we are living history in real time. And it's not just Black history with President Obama becoming the new president, of course, but we are living American history in real time. Now, the biggest question that we have to ask ourselves is if President Obama is going to make history again, and if he's going to be reelected and serve as a 2-term president. the first African American in history. Now, it's a question that we all are asking, and it's a question that we're going to be posing to two of our very own students here at Vanderbilt University. But before we jump into the discussion, I really quickly would like to discuss some of President Obama's latest actions and how these relate to America's future as a whole. Now, on February 13th, President Obama and his staff released his budget proposal for 2013 by the budget process, which controls discretionary spending. Now, this is one of the last pieces of legislation Obama will submit before the November elections. So voters may look to this as a tangible evidence of his goals and achievements, while Republicans tend to regard it as a campaign document. The overall worth and influence of the document is up for debate, as we, of course, will discuss later. As a result of the Budget Control Act of 2011 passed in August, the White House and Congress agreed to cap the discretionary spending. So Obama said that he was forced to make cuts that he otherwise wouldn't have called for. Now, Obama is really known for being very diplomatic and even-tempered, but as the campaign season approaches, he seems to be overtly trying to distance himself from the Republicans, saying his approach rejects the "you're all on your own" economics that have led the widening gap between the richest and the poorest Americans. Before we get into the what the budget is actually calling for, I think we really do need to talk about some of the terminology that's integral in understanding the proposal and, of course, its context. Now, there are two main types of government spending. The first is mandatory, and the second is discretionary, which I mentioned earlier. Mandatory spending encompasses about 70% of the federal budget and does not have to be approved by Congress, as it's covered by laws that are already in place. Now, we've got Medicare, we've got Medicaid, which are government-funded social programs that provide health coverage to the elderly and people with certain disabilities, and people with limited income resources, respectively. They serve as good examples of mandatory spending. Again, Medicare and Medicaid are also classic examples of entitlement spending, which is a subset of mandatory spending in contrast to interest payments on the federal debt, which are mandatory, but again, not entitlements. Now, the budget process really focuses on discretionary spending, or the 30% of the budget that only goes through should Congress pass it. The notion of the president's budget influence is actually on discretionary spending, and it's limited. And some say that it doesn't even matter at all. Some of the people that say this is Bruce Bartlett, who wrote in Forbes that yearly budgets only came into play in 1974, so the U.S. existed for 198 years without passing a single budget. Also, the amount controlled by the budget process has declined by 25% of the total budget since 1970, so there's less of a possible impact to make. Now, Bartlett says that unless real changes are made in our social mandatory spending, again, we're thinking about Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, both Congress and the President will continue to have less control over governmental spending due to excessive waste and throwing money and to poorly operated programs. Now, finally, once the president proposes his budget, Congress passes their budget, which often does not make use of the president's guidelines. The actual money is put into place by the House and Senator appropriations, or appropriators, who don't necessarily follow congressional guidelines as strictly as you think. That being said, voters can use the president's budget proposal as a barometer for what the president holds as important and his plans for the future, which is why there's always a media blitz, as we all know, when the budget is released. All that being said, let's take a look at what the $3.7 billion budget has to offer. Here we've got New York's interactive graphic that really breaks down the budget for us in several different visuals, and we'll run through these to get a better understanding of what the departments are receiving, what their funding are, and which ones are receiving less. Here we've got the greener with the circles, and those are the more increase, and by contrast, we've got the redder circles, the deeper the cut. Circles are sized according to the proposed spending, with the smallest indicator of $1 billion and the largest $1 billion as well. On the left, we have 70% mandatory spending, Most obvious are the Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid departments, which are well protected despite being programs in need of major repair, seeing a 6.7% and 8.4% increase respectively. Now, interestingly enough, we've got the Employment and Training Administration, which actually takes up 44.6% of a hit, a 4.8% increase and allocated to the interest on the public debt, totaling $472 billion. In terms of percentage changes on the discretionary side, as we ease out of the war in Iraq, the military actually took heavy budget cuts. And we got the numbers right here. A 10% decrease for procurement, 4% from operation and maintenance, 2.6% from military personnel spending, and 3.1% for military research development, testing, and evaluation spending. As you can see in the big red splotch, there are right there on the left. Though a relatively small allotment, the Office of Post-Secondary Education received an astronomical 50.9% increase to $3.2 billion, as college tuition is ever increasing, not in conjunction with actually the rates of inflation. The increase in findings for investigating and prosecuting financial crimes comes 1 week after the historic $25 billion settlement between federal and state officials and 5 of the nation's largest banks to provide relief to homeowners affected by the foreclosure crisis. More than $700 billion is proposed to combat the financial mortgage and other fraud and increase $55 million over the previous budget. Right here you can see that the proposed budget would go more towards FBI agents, criminal prosecutors, civil litigators, in-house investigators, and forensics accountants to investigate and prosecute financial fraud. Now here we've got Attorney General Eric Holder Jr., actually, who said that the budget would strengthen the critical efforts to combat financial and mortgage fraud. The Justice Department is seeing a lot of change, and we've got the numbers right here on that change. The first is that the budget also includes a $31.8 million increase from programs to target human trafficking, hate crimes, police misconduct, voting rights enforcement, and cybersecurity threats. A $141.2 million increase is requested for prison and detention efforts. Federal officials said Monday that they expect to open 4 new prisons, and those would be in Alabama, New Hampshire, Mississippi, and West Virginia, adding nearly 2,500 new prison beds. A total of $8.6 billion, or 32% of the justice budget, which would be going towards prisons and detention centers. The justice budget allots $4 million for national security, which of course is a very big topic on the minds of everyone, and that's including investigation of drug trafficking organizations, which ties to terrorist groups, and the expansion of anti-terrorism training to state and local law enforcement agencies. Under this budget, the Office of Justice Programs would see a 101.6% increase, and that's quite a bit. The total budget for the Justice Department, including mandatory spending, is about $36.5 billion compared to last year's, which was only, or you could say more, $43.5 billion. Now, Obama called for a $350 billion, not million, but billion in the new stimulus to maintain lower payroll taxes, bolster domestic manufacturing, lure jobs back from the force overseas, to hire teachers, to retrain workers, and fix the nation's crumbling infrastructure. There would be only modest trims to the federal health care program and no changes to Social Security, the biggest drivers of future borrowing, despite last year's ruckus in the political debate over the federal debt. All in all, discretionary spending, which includes defense and non-defense spending, is expected to fall to its lowest level since Eisenhower, but focuses mainly on R&D, education, and promoting exports through increases for the Education Department, National Science Foundation, Commerce Department, and Energy Department. Obama intend to pay for this. Namely, it's very controversial, and it's going to be through tax hikes on the wealthy. The Bush tax cuts are set to expire, and this time Obama's camp intends to keep them that way. As the Washington Post points out, it seems that, quote, the Obama administration has stopped hiding the full extent of their preferred tax increases. It's assumed that the government will receive $800 billion or so from the expiration of the Bush tax cuts. Doing so would increase revenue by 17.9% of GDP, and should we keep the tax cuts to 19.2% of GDP over the next 10 years. Now, tax revenues in 2011 were near record lows and 15.8% of GDP compared to what we had before, 18.2 under Reagan and 19 under Clinton. Now, before the recession, the last time, they were below 16%, which was in 1950, and we got the Bush tax cuts and that Obama extended, which helped to push them further down, as did the recession, which tends to be bringing revenue down and spending up. When he first came to office, Obama was very adamant about cutting his inherited deficit by half by the end of this term, of course, his first term. We haven't seen that yet, and it's really due to gridlock, policy bust. We got the recession, and Republicans who have clearly noticed. Obama continues to pass ambitious legislation with debt reduction in mind, as seen from this budget. The proposal projects $4 trillion in $4 trillion in saving, which includes the $2.1 trillion in spending cuts from the debt ceiling deal, and projects a $901 billion deficit. Well, the White House could argue that fulfillment of the slash deficit promise would be meant massive contradictions in fiscal policy, which wouldn't have been a smart move, and others could criticize his overly idealistic outlook, which he couldn't live up to, though everyone knows that presidential candidates are overly optimistic with all of their goals. Now, either way, it will be interesting to see what the effects of this proposal turns out to be, and we'll have to see if it's going to be immediate when the Congress puts forth their budget during the campaign. That's all, with a lot of numbers, a lot of stats, and I really would like to thank you so much for taking those numbers down. Right now, I'll kick it over to Sid, who's with two of our top guests from Points of View, Hudson Todd and Sam Atkinson, who will be debating the merits and faults of the proposal and how those influential thoughts and those meanings will be impacting the U.S. later on.
Thanks, Britt, and thanks Hudson and Sam for being with us here today. So essentially the budget that we're looking at supports research and development, education, and promoting exports through increases for the Education Department, the National Science Foundation, the Commerce Department, and the Energy Department. At the same time, discretionary spending in the Justice Department, the Housing Department, and the EPA are getting hit pretty hard in terms of reductions, although granted not by extreme amounts. Do you think these are the right places to focus our attention? Are these the right places where we should respectively be spending and not spending money? And Hudson, why don't we start with you?
You know, I may not know all about these particular items, but I trust in the great wisdom of Barack Obama. You know, he has never led this country astray. He is infallible, and as a result, I support this budget.
That's very emphatic of you, yes. Which is great. But I mean, I think one of the things that's obviously going on right now, you know, Obama is facing a tough re-election battle in 2012, and one of the things Republicans are pressuring him on a lot is the growing deficit. So I agree, Obama. I agree that you seem to think that Obama is doing quite a good job. But at the same time, I think it's important to realize that you know, the budget is something that is a major problem, and something that Obama does need to address, as infallible as he may or may not be.
I would make the general argument that yes, while this budget is going to continue to increase the deficit substantially, there's little we can do due to the economic downturn. If we were to decide to dramatically cut government spending right now, which is what a lot of people would want, a lot of people want balanced budget amendments and things of that nature, they say, well, the only way we can cut the deficit is to cut spending. We should do it now. The problem is, if that's certainly an austerity measure, and the problem is you're taking a lot of resources out of the hands of people. We decided to start paying back our debt right now. It would make the country poorer in the short term, and we can't really afford that. I think if we tried to reduce the deficit right now, we would be in a situation like the United Kingdom. And currently, the United Kingdom, they did something like this. They decided in the middle of one of the worst recessions in recent history, they decided to dramatically cut spending. And and their economy is just doing horribly right now. I mean, the unemployment rate is ridiculously high, and it's because they're cutting things like unemployment benefits, and every time someone receives unemployment benefits, the first thing they do is go spend those benefits, and that stimulates the economy because that money increases demand for goods, and when demand is increased for goods, then more production takes place, and more people are hired. And when you're taking money out of the economy at a stage like this, what you're going to do is ultimately prolong the recession and actually make things worse long term.
All right, so Sam, imagine you have a different perspective. Let's see what you say. Yeah.
The fact is, our economy is not stable right now. Businesses don't trust that they're going to be able to grow, and you need steadiness for the market to grow. Barack Obama promised that he would cut the $1.4 billion deficit he inherited in 2009 in half by the time he was up for re-election. That's not happening. This budget, presenting its best case scenario, offers a $900 billion deficit spending. That's just not acceptable. And when you're looking for the United States' long-term interests, you have to consider this year alone, we paid over $450 billion just in interest on our deficit. That's money that could be going to help people, money that could be going to fight the wars, money that could be going to increase our security. That's money we're wasting. We can't put the problem off.
And I think what you're talking about is something that's felt by a lot of people in this country, and part of the reason that a lot of the Republican presidential candidates are focusing their attention on this very issue. So I guess looking at what President Obama has proposed, there are some spending cuts, and with that in mind, are the areas that he's proposing spending cuts the right areas, the wrong areas? Are there additional areas that you think we should be cutting that he has not addressed yet?
Well, there are. First off, President Obama takes a big chunk out of defense spending. That's not an area we can afford to let down on. As you've seen lately, the situation in the Middle East has been spiraling out of control. There's talk of a war with Iran. Now isn't the time to cut our money on our military spending. That just sends the wrong message to the world. And on top of that, Barack Obama's budget fails to address entitlement spending. He just doesn't take it on in this budget. We need a president who's going to show leadership. This is just a weak budget.
All right, so actually, I'm going to come back to something you said about defense spending. This is an area that's especially contentious. A lot of times, it's an area that causes a lot of criticism, especially, as we're coming out of two wars. So Hudson, your thoughts on defense spending? Are we making America weaker? Are we becoming a little bit less powerful of a nation in the world's eyes as a result of these kind of cuts?
I think conservatives fail to recognize that warfare of the past is now over. That we have entered a new era of existence of the human species, and I think that we have nuclear deterrence and wars between two democracies virtually never occur at all. And countries are becoming more democratized as time goes on, and the number of dictatorships. I mean, think how many countries there were like North Korea just 50 years ago. There were multiple countries like that, inflicting horrible suffering on the people through tyrannical governments. And now it's just been narrowed down. It hasn't been narrowed down through huge wars. It's been narrowed down through them seeing how the successes of a market economy and the successes of democracy, and seeing how to treat their citizens right and how they can flourish with that. And so the idea that we need some massive military. It's anachronistic in this time period. It's just something that is just obsolete, and that there just aren't going to be huge wars like we used to have. We don't need these very powerful high-tech fighter jets. We don't need to be developing these technologies because there's never going to be an enemy we're facing that has those kind of technologies that would require us to deploy something like that.
And I think you're advocating strength through weakness there. You're saying that if the military is less strong, America will be more safe. And time again, history has shown that wrong. When Ronald Reagan was staring down the Soviet Union in the 80s, he beefed up the military. We didn't win because we were weak. We didn't allow an environment to develop where democracy could flourish by being a weak nation. We did that by being strong. And there's turmoil all over the world today, in the Middle East, in Iran, in Bahrain, in Egypt, in Tunisia. And we need a secure world environment where we can confront the evil that's there. And if there's a weaker America, if there's a weaker military, we just won't be able to address those challenges.
So is your concern more with America's ability to actually respond to challenges in the Middle East and things of that nature? Because earlier on you discussed sort of this perception of America as weaker and the effect that would have. Which do you think is the bigger problem in terms of cuts in defense spending?
Well, it's a global situation now. You can't just address one of the factors. But you do have to focus on the Middle East. And you also have to focus on the Pacific, which is where Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, your president, Hudson, have been saying they want the focus to be.
Your president, too.
He is, exactly, and it's our military, too. And so part of that strategy is being able to combat China in the South Sea, in the Pacific. And to do that, we need a stronger Navy, and we need more advanced aircraft. This is halfway around the world. Barack Obama's endorsed that strategy, but this budget cuts Navy funding, cuts the amount of ships we'll be producing, and cuts the number of advanced fighter jets we'll be ordering. That makes America weaker in the Pacific as well.
And I don't want to get too hung up on sort of the defense issue, but I think you guys both presented really good points. But the deficit isn't just about sort of cost; it's also about revenues. So let's talk a little bit about that. Specifically, Obama's plan to pay for all this will raise revenues of over $1.5 billion in various ways, including a new $61 billion tax on big banks, a $41 billion hike on levies on fossil fuel producers, allowing a tax cut for those earning more than $250,000 a year, adopted by President George W. Bush, to expire, and also embracing a surtax on those that make more than $1 million a year. This goes back, in a lot of ways to the big controversy when the Bush tax cuts were about to expire several months ago, that Obama eventually, let in place. So what makes sense now in terms of revenue generation? And Hudson, why don't we start with you?
Well, clearly you can't just let the budget spiral out of control indefinitely. You're going to have to, worry about it eventually. And I think now's the time to start worrying about it. And maybe, and we want to start, paying down in the next few years. But I think the way to do that, and when you're thinking about, people are going to have to make sacrifices. People who are receiving money now are going to have to, stop receiving that money. And I think the appropriate place, so when you're thinking about, where can we cut to make the do the least damage to people, keep Americans as well off as possible. Well, let's talk about revenue generation. I think taxing the wealthy more would be the way to do the least damage if you're going to have to tax anybody more. Now, I know they're already paying the lion's share of tax. I know the top 1% already pays like 35% of total taxes. And I don't dispute that, but I think that if you also look at how much money they have and how well they're doing very well. There's only so much you can ask of them before they do just move everything overseas and stop worrying about a tax burden. And I acknowledge that as well, but I think minor increases, the kind of increases that Obama's proposing, are actually very reasonable, would increase revenue, and wouldn't destroy any type of business environment we've created in the United States.
Sam, what about you? Where should our revenues come from? Is this the right approach?
Well, it's just not. Sometimes you can only raise so much revenue, as you said. Sometimes you have to cut spending. Now, Barack Obama's budget, it does try and raise revenue, and we do need to raise some. But in addition to the things you mentioned, Barack Obama's talking about tax reform, and he's talking about taxing corporations overseas. So if you're based in the U.S. and you make money overseas, you're going to have to pay taxes on that. Well, the problem is, if you do that, companies are just going to move overseas. And so Barack Obama's policies, by being opposed to business, by being opposed to the wealthy, you can't keep doing that. You can't keep trying to redistribute wealth because
more
of leave.
Specifically, in what ways is he against business or against the wealthy?
Right. Well, by taxing that upper bracket, by leveling what Hudson said was already a heavy burden against them, these people are just going to move their money overseas. You see that within states in the U.S. is if a state taxes too much, it's wealthy people move next door. They move to another state. You're going to see that happen in the global economy nowadays. You can't drive out the wealthy. You make money by encouraging investment and by collecting more taxes because the economy.
So let me ask you something. Do you think that the deficit could be reduced to an acceptable amount to you specifically and exclusively by cutting spending and not increasing revenues?
Over time, yes. At some point you have to freeze spending. You can't take all of the cuts at once. That would obviously cripple the economy. You can't take too much off. But you need to start now because we need to, not acquire as much interest on our debt. And beyond that, over time, you'd pay this down. This doesn't have to be doesn't have to happen in 1 year, but we need to start now.
Okay, so speaking of cuts, returning to that issue, what departments, and Sam, we'll start with you this time, what departments do you think are the most critical within the United States government and deserve increase in funding, and which do you think, if any, and which do you think should get less funding, perhaps?
Well, again, the Department of Defense, it should have gotten increases, and where it got cut on R&D, areas like that. That's not right for the future. But then you have a department like Health and Homeland Security, Health and Human Services. They're getting over $2 billion, or $200 billion a year for a lot of miscellaneous things, in addition to all the entitlements they're administering. Until you tax entitlement spending, you're not going to solve the problem.
Yeah, I think that's something that's been sort of well hashed out by economists alike. So Hudson, what do you think of all that? Areas that need to get more funding, less funding, discretionary spending especially.
I do think that obviously you're going to have to tackle entitlements at some point, and so I think you're going to have to raise the retirement age of Social Security a little bit, and you're going to have to cut the benefits that people receive, just because that's something that has to happen, regardless of what you think. You can't balance the budget without tackling entitlements. Also with Medicare, I think Medicare is the ripest area for cutting because there's just so much waste there. If you look at between state spending on Medicare, some states spend 33% more than other states on their elderly per capita, but actually don't even have better health outcomes. And so there's a lot of unnecessary procedures going through in Medicare that deserve to be cut also. But at the same time, I mean, like, don't get me wrong, I would like to extend Medicare to everybody simply for the fact that people are already paying a lot of money for their health insurance. It costs a lot to have the very inefficient system we have right now with, just the whole private system. And just if people were paying that in taxes instead of paying their health insurance provider directly, it wouldn't. There would be no significant difference there. People act like providing Medicare to all would cost so much more, but actually we're already paying for health care in it would redirect the burden more towards the wealthy because that's where the majority of tax dollars go. But when you see how many people can't even afford Medicare, and you look at the fact that European nations with socialized health insurance systems actually are doing quite well in health outcomes and are doing quite well in how much it costs per capita, and even though they smoke much more than we do, even though they have a lot of bad habits that we don't have. I think it makes a lot of sense to both cut how much we're giving to the elderly and actually then extend more to to everyday Americans.
So we are sort of running out of time, but I did want to say, as a sort of last party question, if you could give sort of one line of advice to Congress and the President as this budget sort of goes forward and is debated continuously over the next several weeks and months, what would it be? So Sam, what's your one line of advice?
All right, well, you need to start with tackling entitlements. You need to make bold change. Being weak isn't going to solve the problems our nation faces. And so I tell them to step up to the plate and make real substantive change.
Hudson?
I would tell Obama to just not do anything crazy before the election. I mean, obviously he's not going to throw out some ridiculously controversial budget right before the election comes around. So I think once he gets reelected, though, you might really see where the direction that he wants to take the country in. But I think he has been very cautious during his first term because he knows he needs to win moderates over in 2012.
Great. Well, thank you guys both so much for joining us. You've been great. Please come back sometime again soon. And for all of you watching at home, thanks so much for watching. And we'll see you in 2 weeks right here on Points of View.